planet was like. So this is going to be a really brief description of the history of life on Earth. History of life on Earth. And I'm not going to go into tremendous detail here. I could go into a lot of detail, but I'm really going to stick to the basics here because I just want you to have kind of a map in your mind about those 6 kingdoms that we talked about and when they emerged and how there's a pattern in their emergence in terms of the simplest ones coming first and then more and more complex kingdoms arriving after and so forth. So if this line represents the history of life on Earth, we go all the back here. This is all the way back at 3.5 billion years ago. BYA means billion years ago. That's a very, very long time. And that marks the first fossil evidence of bacteria cells, right? So we have the first life is right here, and it was the first cells, and they were prokaryotic. And that should make sense to you because prokaryotic cells are much simpler than any other type of cell on the planet. They're still with us. So the 2 kingdoms from your kingdom thing that you did, you may recognize these. The 2 kingdoms that were emerged back then were the eubacteria, and the archaebacteria. The 2 prokaryotic kingdoms, which have lasted until the present. The present over here, we still have representatives of all those bacteria. They may not be the exact precise species that were back here, but we still have eubacterians and archaebacterians in our world here in the present, which is all the way over here. Okay. Go back to the beginning again. So just to kind of define these eras for you, these eras are very large. I'm not going to go into the detailed periods, but this entire long period of time here between 3.5 billion years and actually about 0.5 billion years ago, right there. That long period of time is called the Precambrian Era. Precambrian Era, and you could go into detail in terms of the Archean and the Hadean and all of that, but I'm not going to worry about that. Precambrian Era, that's what we're going to call it. The Precambrian Era, in terms of what you might think, is really kind of boring. The Precambrian Era was a bunch of little tiny single cells floating around in the water, and that was it. There was nothing interesting. There wasn't really any land yet. If there was land, it had nothing on it. It didn't even have soil, no plants, no moss, nothing. There was nothing but single-celled, very, very simple organisms in the waters of the earth. That's all. And way back here, in this region back here, the earth looked very different than it does now. The skies were probably not blue. The skies probably did not turn blue until you had the advent of oxygen in the atmosphere and in the water, which came with the first photosynthesis. So I'm not going to go into too much more detail, but the main events that happened in the Precambrian Era, a very important one was about 2 billion years ago. There was an event called endosymbiosis, which you should know. Endosymbiosis was the theory that explains how we got the first eukaryotic single cells, the first eukaryotic single cells, which is basically the Protista kingdom, which again is still with us, right? So we have the advent of the first prokaryotic kingdoms over here, right? Very basic prokaryotes, no nucleus here, and then the first protistans, which may have looked something like the amoeba or the parameciums or the algae floating around in that tank right there. So the protistans are single-cell eukaryotes. They have a nucleus. They have things like mitochondria in them, which may have been free-swimming archaebacterians that could aerobically respire, right? That swam into another bigger bacteria, and suddenly then it was a protistan, right? But we won't go too far into that. But in any case, here come the protista. Some of those bacteria over here did the first photosynthesizing. So you got your first oxygen in the atmosphere maybe right around there. But I really want to concentrate more on the kingdoms. So over here, somewhere over here, we think you got the first multicellular organisms, right? Just because you are a eukaryote does not mean you're multicellular. There are plenty of single-celled protistans that are still alive to this day that are just made of one single cell. But here's where life gets more exciting, because now you have really exciting things like worms and jellyfish and corals and other very, very strange things that are not anymore, like trilobites and things like that. And things get really interesting here, though. These eras are the ones you may recognize more. This is the Paleozoic era. This is the Paleozoic era, which you have the invasion of the land by plants. So you start to have plants and animals on land. Plants, insects, the first frogs. There was kind of an age of amphibians that happened there. There were some lizards. Right? And there were some giant, funny-looking ferns and all kinds of things like that. Okay. The next era is the Mesozoic era, and that's everybody's favorite because that's where the dinosaurs are. Right, so here we have the age of dinosaurs. So you may remember that, a very large multicellular animal. And then the era that we're living in right now is the Cenozoic era. The Cenozoic era is the age of mammals. It's our era. This is our time. Although humans don't show up until like right in the last fingernail of time right here. We have not been here very long compared to most other organisms. We just barely showed up, right? Which doesn't mean that we're going to disappear anytime soon, but we just haven't been here very long. Okay, so there you go with this. So the kingdoms that are probably the most interesting kingdoms to you really didn't arrive until this point here, where you started to have the plants, the advanced fungi, and animals. Those kingdoms arrived around there and have dominated since, right? Okay. So there you have a timeline, and all that really tells you is when things showed up and maybe how long they've been here and maybe some of their characteristics because I added them. Okay. So I'm going to make that the first part of my presentation. I'm going to cut that off right here. There's your history timeline of the Earth.